I'm Ann Collins Goodyear, co-director of the Bowdoin College Museum of Art, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Edmonia Lewis and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, New Insights. Our program this afternoon is offered in collaboration with the Howard University Gallery of Art, and we want to offer our warm thanks to Catherine Coney Ali, co-executive director for the Gallery of Art, and art history lecturer at Howard, for all she has done to make today's event possible. And on that note, we are thrilled to be joined by her students for this afternoon's discussion. Today's virtual event takes place in coordination with Poetic Truths, Hawthorne, Longfellow, and American Visual Culture, 1840 to 1880, now on view at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art through July 20th. Organized by Laura Sprague, Senior Consulting Curator at the BCMA, this fascinating exhibition explores the profound interconnection between the literature of two of our nation's best-known authors, Nathaniel Hawthorne and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and the visual arts, which both responded to their narratives and influenced them. We are grateful to Laura for sharing the discoveries that her research has revealed, and we want to express our sincere appreciation to the numerous institutional and private lenders to Poetic Truths. Among our lenders is the Howard University Gallery of Art, and we are deeply grateful to our colleagues there for making available important sculptures by Edmonia Lewis, about which you will hear more in due course, as well as a beautiful painting by Robert Duncanson. We also want to acknowledge the Peabody Essex Museum and the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters National Historic Site, for their generous loans to Poetic Truths, which include portraits of both Hawthorne and Longfellow. As always, art builds community. And it is perhaps worth noting that Hawthorne and Longfellow were classmates at Bowdoin, both graduating in 1825, and that both writers also knew Edmonia Lewis through their travels in Rome. We are delighted that the BCMA's Poetic Truths exhibition and programs such as this one can continue to build on this historic network of interconnections by stimulating ongoing engagement with ideas that remain urgent in our own era. Before turning the floor to Laura Sprague, whose expertise largely underpins today's convening, I want to say a word about the organization of our event. Each of our speakers will provide presentations of approximately 15 minutes, following which we look forward to a robust discussion. Please feel free to enter your questions into the chat during the presentations. After the conclusion of the final talk, we invite audience members either to continue to use the chat function or to use the reaction button to raise your hand electronically. We would like to provide priority in the discussion period to questions raised by students from Howard and Bowdoin, so please identify yourself as such. I offer a final thanks to my colleague Danielle Margado for her assistance. We are delighted to be joined today by such a knowledgeable panel of specialists and a distinguished audience. Thank you all for being with us. Laura, let me now invite you to share your own reflections and to introduce our first speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. And thank you everyone for joining us today. It's a really exciting program. I'm looking forward to it. It's been a great privilege to curate Poetic Truths. And I'd also especially like to thank my colleagues at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art for the stunning exhibition installation. And if you're able to visit us in Brunswick, please do. But if you're not able to come, rest assured that the Poetic Truths website at Bowdoin has recently been converted to a really full-fledged digital catalog where you'll find the exhibition checklist and many other resources. And it will be available long after the exhibition closes. Poetic Truths has been extremely well received, and we are very grateful for the generous loans from many public and private collectors. And it was just a thrill to find both Robert Duncanson's landscape and the Edmonia Lewis cabinet busts of Hiawatha and Minnehaha in the collection at Howard. And I enjoyed working with Catherine Coney and Janie Ritter at the Gallery of Art. And we developed this webinar together. And we're thrilled to have such a great group of scholars who agreed to participate. And it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Jeffrey Richmond Mall. Jeffrey joined the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts in 2023 as the George Putnam Curator of American Art, and he oversees a magnificent collection that spans over 4 centuries. He received his PhD in art history at the University of Delaware and a BA from Princeton University. His publications are numerous, including exhibition catalogs at the Georgia Museum of Fine Arts, including Extraordinary, Magic, Mystery, and Imagination in American Realism in 2021, and Reckonings and Reconstructions, Southern Photography from the Do Good Fund of 2022. His essays have appeared in numerous journals, including the Winterthur Portfolio and Panorama, the Journal of the Association of Historians of American Art. And Jeffrey, as we've heard, is co-curating with Shania Harris the exhibition Edmonia Lewis, Said in Stone, and his presentation today provides an overview of the exhibition and their curatorial process. So join me in welcoming Jeffrey.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Danielle. Thank you, everyone at Bowdoin. And hello to everyone attending this afternoon or whatever time it might be where you are. It's a pleasure to participate today and share a little bit of a preview of this exhibition, Edmonia Lewis, Said in Stone. So I'm going to share my screen. And we will dive in. So this exhibition, Edmonia Lewis, Said in Stone, will open next February at the Peabody Essex Museum. And as I guess the first speaker in this webinar, it's probably a good idea for me to give a very brief biography of Lewis, although I'm sure we will be hearing much about her this afternoon. Edmonia Lewis was the first sculptor of Afro-Caribbean and indigenous descent, Anishinaabe or Mississauga descent, to achieve international fame in the 19th century. And this exhibition is an opportunity to explore how Lewis used her sculptures to promote community, reform, and resilience, and challenge narratives of marginalization and erasure in her time and in the generations that followed her work. So the title Edmonia Lewis, Said in Stone, I think the best way to convey the ideas behind this phrase is just a excerpt from our catalog, which will come out accompanying the exhibition next February. And this is the idea, as you see quoted here, that in the absence of a large archive, Lewis passes away in England in 1907 and leaves behind a very scant paper trail. And given the scarcity of first-person sources that allow us to read Lewis's own voice, we, my co-curator Shania Harris and I, give space for these sculptures themselves to speak. And to continue reading here from our introduction to the book, to endow her sculptures with speech and to imbue stones with life also underscores the enduring role of Lewis's Mississauga familial history and Anishinaabe worldviews, where stones can be animate beings with stories, memories, and lives of their own. By recognizing Lewis as an artist whose most popular works were based on great works of literature, we also emphasize the importance of orality and text to Lewis's art and the associations in her work among performance, declaration, and pictorialization. In short, Edmonia Lewis, Said in Stone, seeks to reanimate Lewis's voice and agency through the wide-ranging sculptures she produced across her artistic lifetime, through what she said in stone. So this exhibition, as we conceive of it, and it's still a work in progress. So I hope to kind of bring you behind the scenes in a way as we go about this project of curating a show of Lewis's sculpture. It's divided into three core sections. The first of which is thinking about Lewis's sculptures in the context of anti-slavery and emancipation in the 19th century. Many of us are probably familiar with the sculpture It Left Forever Free by Lewis and Howard's collection from 1866 to 67. What you may not know is that Lewis's first sculpture on the subject of emancipation was a work entitled Freed Woman, which it was a sculpture of a mother and child, and this freed woman, upon hearing of her liberation, is the subject. So throughout the exhibition, we're really having to wrestle with the fact that there are a number of works by Lewis that unfortunately do not survive today. They were lost, they were destroyed, they've disappeared. We've recovered some objects in the course of organizing the show, but objects like her Freedwoman sculpture, which we know about from accounts from journalists visiting her studio in Rome in the mid-1860s, works like this, we hope to give presence in the exhibition through sculptures like Sergeant Johnson's Forever Free, sculptures by artists of color, particularly Black women sculptors in other places of the show, also as a way of demonstrating Lewis's longstanding legacy and the generations that followed her, as a way to push back against this notion that Lewis was forgotten, that she vanished to history, and really underscore the fact that her legacy remained vital among various communities, and especially, as we'll hear from my colleague Shania Harris, the vital role of institutions like Howard and curators like James Porter in keeping her legacy alive. So anti-slavery and emancipation, this section also thinks about the communities of social and political reform, relief, and redress with which Lewis's sculptures are connected. Organizations like the Colored Ladies Commission of Boston, whose fair in 1864 was the public debut of Lewis's sculpture, with a small statuette of Sergeant William Carney from the Massachusetts 54th. So what were the roles of African-American and specifically Black women-led organizations in sustaining Lewis's career and really launching her as a professional artist in the 1860s, even before she travels to Rome in 1866. Then we have a section that thinks about indigenous artistic worlds, and specifically underscoring the Anishinaabe artistic traditions that were central to Lewis's artistic development from childhood and her eventual exploration of Native American imagery in the Longfellow-inspired sculptures like the old arrow maker here on the left. So what we see on the right are three different examples of wood carving, of quill work, and of weaving or plaiting that would have been made by Anishinaabe and specifically Mississauga communities in the 1850s during Lewis's childhood, a childhood which she describes in later accounts as a time when she learned from, quote unquote, my mother's people, being raised by her maternal aunts, having been orphaned as a child, and thinking really intentionally about the visual and material worlds that grounded her and that would have inspired a lifetime of artistry. This is also a section where we're thinking about notions of indigenous diplomacy. So how a sculpture like the marriage of Hiawatha on the right is a marriage of two nations, of an Ojibwe warrior and a Dakota woman, and how the coming together of Minnehaha and Hiawatha also symbolically is sort of an act of inter-tribal, international diplomacy through their marriage. So thinking about this notion of diplomacy with Lewis as a woman who herself, Black and Indigenous woman artist, working between Europe and the United States, also navigates a kind of diplomacy of her own identities throughout her career. So we'll also use portraits of 19th century individuals like Mangwadas, George Henry, who was a Mississauga diplomat, who also traveled to Europe and around the United States, and the kind of treaty medallions that you see hanging on his sash that speak to his role as a kind of intercessor between cultures. And then finally, Lewis's steeping within the artistic worlds of the Anishinaabe people, of her people, helps us think about her early exposure to art markets from a young age, traveling to places like Niagara Falls and Watkins Glen with her mother's family, making and selling works to a larger, market-driven public, and how we might see things like this Ojibwe lidded box in the upper left, this Huron calling card tray, or this baby carrier, also Anishinaabe mid-19th century, all of which come from the Peabody Essex Museum's own collection, and conversations with objects like Lewis's cabinet-sized bust, which were made for a market. She talks about on when a journalist came to her studio and asked about these small bust, cabinet-sized busts. Journalists asked about them, and she said, "Well, you have to make work that people can buy, and different people have different budgets." So this is Lewis's savvy as a professional artist, catering to different price points through her patrons, the people who came through her studio in Italy. We also really want to focus the viewer on making and thinking about the studio as both a space of making and a space of performance. So there was a technical study that we commissioned with an objects conservator to look very closely at the material artifacts, the tool marks, the surfaces, the sort of technical process behind Lewis's sculptures, to help us learn more about her larger practice, which is information that otherwise doesn't survive for us. I mentioned Lewis as a savvy businesswoman, and she's very savvy too in her own self-representation, her own promotion through print media, through newspapers, through the popular press. And so there's a section that thinks about Lewis and photography, connecting her to other individuals like Frederick Douglass, whom Lewis met as a student at Oberlin College in the 1860s, who encouraged Lewis to go east when she was unceremoniously kicked out of Oberlin College. And Douglass becomes really an important advocate for her career for decades to follow. Surely Douglass's use of photography in the cause of Black representation and civil rights must have influenced her own use of photography. And here we see on the left, for example, Lewis's use of the popular press to promote her own image and images of her sculptures. I use this quote, "a massive gaping absence," because it's a quote drawn from a recent video work by the artist Madeline Hunt Ehrlich, which premiered in the exhibition Flight in Egypt at the Met last year, which is about a video work about the rediscovery of the death of Cleopatra in the 1980s. That object is also an absence from our show because it is too fragile to leave the Smithsonian's building. So we were thinking about, how do we also exhibit sculptures that can't move, that can't travel? But I underscore the death of Cleopatra as really her magnum opus in 1876 at the Philadelphia Centennial. On the left, you see a printed 3D scan of the death of Cleopatra and sort of the ways that we are thinking about how do we give physical presence to something that can't move. And in the center, Hiram Power's display of the Greek slave at the 1851 Crystal Palace exposition. Lewis was known to have displayed her Death of Cleopatra under a canopy of red and gold at the Centennial. So we're also thinking about how theatrically can we summon this moment of Lewis's debut at the Centennial, again, through a sculpture that's not physically there. Maybe a hologram, we'll see. And then finally, the last section, religion, mythology, and transcendence, thinks really seriously about, especially in Lewis's late career, the impact of her conversion to Roman Catholicism and how the language of religion offers her a language of liberation and transcendence. Figures like Hagar from the Smithsonian American Art Museum's collection, this woman enslaved to Abraham and Sarah in the Old Testament, whom Lewis sculpts at this moment of her divine rescue in the wilderness. Hagar being a popular subject among other African-American artists like Henry Ossawa Tanner in his Mothers of the Bible series, and within Black Christianity in the 19th century more broadly. Um, an individual like Moses, the liberator of his people, whom Lewis sculpts in 1876, on the left there, 75. And then on the right, we see this painting by Henry Ossawa Tanner of Christ Learning to Read. And this is sort of where we close our story on Lewis, which is in her late career, she's involved very actively with Black Catholic and Protestant churches in the United States by sending a number of sculptures of the Virgin and Child to churches in Baltimore, St. Louis, Chicago. These are congregations and sort of missions and convents that are very actively involved in serving widows and orphans. And I think Lewis's sculptures in her late career, her religious themed sculptures, become a way of further advancing this mission that she has throughout her work that begins with really Forever Free in 1866, or even the Freed Women before that, and continues through to the end with sculptures of the Virgin Mary, and thinking about the marginalized, the disenfranchised, and how her work can serve these religious communities in the United States whose missions are very actively serving widows and orphans. And Lewis herself, having been orphaned, that cause must have been very dear to her as well. And so this is kind of where we end too, is with still missing works. Here's an interior view of a church in Baltimore, the Church of St. Mary the Virgin, with this beautiful relief sculpture that was displayed above the altar of the adoration of the Magi, the three wise men visiting Christ and Mary and Joseph at his birth and following his birth in Bethlehem. This church burns down in the 1940s. And so all we have to represent it is this photograph. But again, it reiterates Lewis's longstanding ties through the end of her lifetime, through the end of her career, to a larger religious community that had a shared affinity for serving those who were disenfranchised, who were impoverished, and a way of really sort of bringing her life full circle through her sculpture. I'll close by saying the exhibition opens next February, as I said, at the Peabody Essex Museum. It will then travel to our co-organizers, the Georgia Museum of Art, in August, and then on to the North Carolina Museum of Art in spring 2027. I hope you all will have a chance to see it at one or several or all of the locations, and I appreciate the chance to share it with you today. So with that, I believe my colleague Shania Harris is here, so I am going to introduce her. So Shania Harris is the Larry D. and Brenda A. Thompson Curator of African American and African Diasporic Art at the Georgia Museum of Art, where she's worked since 2015. She began her museum career in North Carolina, where she earned a PhD in art history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and an undergraduate degree in African American Studies from Yale University. She's curated a number of exhibitions and award-winning publications, including most recently Emma Amos' Color Odyssey, which traveled to the Munson Museum and the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And she completed a fellowship at the Center for Curatorial Leadership in 2021 and was named recently the Georgia Association Museums Museum Professional of the Year. So hand it off to my fearless colleague, Shania, now to continue with more on Lewis.
Okay, I'm trying to share, let's see. As usual, my screen eludes me. For some reason, it's not like letting me see the little legend where you can like pull up where I can share.
Sonia, do you want me to pull up your slides? It's Danielle.
Yeah, if you can, that'd be great.
I will do that.
Okay, is there, let's see. The last time I had to like scroll through to see if there was anything up. Is there anything up yet?
Not
Not
yet.
yet. My screen is not letting me share right now either, but let me, it'll just,
Okay.
my computer's not letting me do it. I apologize. Um, Let me send it to Anne. Maybe Anne can do it.
Yep, happy to.
Okay.
Yeah, all I see is like an arrow at the bottom, like that shows me the group, but not
Do
the
you see a
little,
green, do you see a green share button at the bottom?
no.
Okay. I wonder if you make your screen bigger, it might show then.
I tried to do that. Let me try it more. Okay, I made it as big as I can make it, but it's still not showing any buttons, just the arrows. Can we try different views? Okay, that's not helping. That's not helping.
Danielle, you can also send it, since mine worked, you can also send it to me and I can run slides. You can,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, just sent it.
Okay, give me 1 second. I'm pulling it up now.
Wonderful.
Are you seeing the presenter view or the full view?
We just saw what looked like the full view a moment ago, Jeff.
Oh,
I
uh,
think, but
how did you
Tanya,
get to
you would
that?
know better than me.
Okay, let's see. I don't. Did anything happen?
Jeff, it looked like it was up a moment ago. Was that from your computer?
Yeah, it should be showing.
Oh,
Let me bring this over
oh,
here and try it
I
over
bet it's
here.
try. I wonder if it's mirroring.
I just saw it just to jump in. I just saw it now it's gone, but it was there. Here, it looks like it's coming on.
There
Yeah,
we go.
looks good.
So when I make it full screen, it looks like,
You know
does
what?
that cause a problem?
I'd leave it like that. Oh, there, you just got it.
We
Okay.
good?
Yeah.
Uh,
Can you
It's
see
perfect
it,
now.
Tanya?
No, I can't see it.
Shania, it's the postage stamp. I'll just say next slide and we'll wing it.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, so okay, we'll start with the postage stamp. So, hello everybody. I'm sorry about this technical difficulty. I don't know. Sometimes when I think that when I update Zoom, it makes it worse. But anyway. So yeah, so Jeff already gave the overview of the project. And I always say that, my colleague, as you can already tell, is extremely thorough. And extremely important to this project. And I'm proud to have been working with him for the past, what has it been, 5 years now, Jeff? I know you're tired of me. But as he mentioned earlier, as we uncover Lewis, there's so much we think we know, but then so many things that we don't really know, or that, all these discoveries that have arisen just in the process of research. And for that first slide, of the Edmonia Lewis stamp that was designed and um, that came about through the U.S. Postal Service in 2022, the thing that, is always been interesting and kind of curious about talking about Lewis is just how many revivals she's had. Just as much as you don't know about her, then there's a revival of her popularity in a contemporary culture, whether it be in research or whether it be through the acquisition of works, in certain museum collections, or just as a figure in, we found everything from cartoons that or children's books that feature Lewis as a sculptor, kind of as an inspirational figure or aspirational figure, as well as a kind of a prototype for feminist artistry. So I think that, for me particularly, having studied African American artists and obviously having an interest in women artists, it's been interesting to see how Lewis's kind of the arc of her career has been described over and over again. There's some stories that keep repeating themselves, but now there's the opportunity to create new stories about Lewis through her works. And so the stamp kind of represents this both continuity, but also kind of innovation around thinking about Lewis, from the standpoint that the stamp itself is a design by, someone who works, kind of designs the stamps for the U.S. Postal Service, Antonio Alcala, who based it on a painting by an artist who teaches in Mississippi, named Alex Bostic, who in turn based his painting on a carte de visite by Augustus Marshall. And so there's been this attempt again over time, both by Lewis herself, but also by others that follow her, to keep kind of the image of Lewis, but also the memory of her work alive. Oh, so Jeff, what's my next slide?
Isn't this fun doing it blind? It's
Yeah, I know.
the Minnehaha and Hiawatha bus.
Okay. So my exposure to Lewis, as in many cases, was through coursework as an undergraduate, and then also through viewing works and museum collections as a curator. And, from all that I can remember, is Lewis was kind of this singular figure that produced not only new unique sculptures like the Minnehaha and Hiawatha, portrait bust, or, cabinet-sized busts, but one in which, like kind of the singular figure that, and particularly women artists, as kind of an internationally acclaimed artist. The other part of it was that I learned was kind of the importance of Lewis among collections of Black colleges, or at least the scholarship around early artists emerging out of it. So even in cases where there weren't examples of Lewis, um, the works in collections like Howard's or Tuskegee were critical in understanding Lewis's importance, particularly because the scholars that emerged out of those spaces oftentimes produced the most original early scholarship on Lewis. And so, these two cabinet-sized busts in Howard's collection are really important, not only because they speak about the type of work that Lewis produced, but also the importance of repositories for collecting what is, only a select number of extant examples of by Lewis. So next slide is
Forever Free.
Forever Free. Okay, thank you for, I kind of figured that, but just in case. So the seminal example for Edmonia Lewis, that's also housed obviously at Howard, is Forever Free. This particular sculpture being kind of an early example, emancipation imagery, much has been written about the work itself, everything from studying the kind of compositional features, kind of the iconography of the chains, of the kneeling figure. In fact, that's one, one example. Jeff talked a little bit about lost works or early works that maybe have not been seen by many audiences. We're still struggling to get a loan from a private collector of a work that might be the prototype for the kneeling figure that is accompanying the standing figure that with the upraised arm, to kind of get a sense of Lewis's, she had a tendency to kind of fuse a lot of different, currents that were running in her mind and also types of imagery, everything from the abolitionist symbolism of the kneeling figure, am I not a man? Or in this case, am I not a woman? As well as, religious imagery, like piety. I mean, the suggestion of piety, the suggestion of liberation, through transcendence, through, spirituality, in fact. Lewis's Catholicism being, kind of infused there as well. And as well as, the kind of tried and true aspect that a lot of scholars have talked about in terms of, Lewis's own ancestry or the suggestion of, you know, peoples of African descent being represented in some of his sculptures, which, in many cases is kind of a rarity. And so that this sculpture becomes a way of kind of invoking that as well, for African American audiences, in particular in those early years. Next slide. I'm going to have to pull my slides up. So I can remember what
Yeah, James Porter with Forever Free in the Modern Negro Art volume.
So one thing that has always intrigued me, not only about the sculptures themselves, but also
Excuse me, sorry to break in. Jeff, we don't see that slide right now.
Oh,
I can see it.
I can see
Yeah,
it.
I can see it as well.
Can you? All right, well, it's ghost in the machine.
it's
Keep going.
disappearing. So look, now I pulled up my slides so that I can see it on my screen. I can't see you all anymore. So I was saying that one of the things that's always fascinated me was the presence of early African American, scholarship, by artists slash art historians and curators. And one of the earlier examples of the 20th century through which Lewis really, again, leading into the 20th century, that was when her main revival occurred in terms of scholarship, was through the figure of James Amos Porter, famously both an artist, art historian, the chair of the Howard University Department of Art for a long time, as well as I guess the original curator and director of the Gallery of Art. And what I always knew that Porter was involved with obviously scholarship on Edmonia Lewis, in part, due to, the entries that were in his classic text, Modern Negro Art, originally published in 1943. But I didn't quite know kind of the extent of it until, just not too long ago, I really began to, I went to Emory University, which has in their archives, you go to the next slide, Jeff. I can't see it, so just let me know when it's up.
Yep.
Okay. Emory University, which has a repository of James Amos Porter's papers, at their archival at the Rose Manuscript and Archives and Rare Book Library. And I thought it was important for me to go there, not just to identify the Edmonia Lewis folder, but also to kind of think about, how scholarship is transmitted over time. A lot of Lewis's discussions about Lewis, maybe through popular press and even her own self-representation is really important, but also how do scholars, kind of propagate that information over time. Um, Famously in modern Negro art, James Porter kind of mentions Lewis as largely a forgotten figure in history, and that was something that he wanted to remedy. But I didn't really realize the extent to which until I started looking at the archive some. And so it was largely, I think, a 40-year odyssey that Porter had with, I mean, starting back, I think as early as the 30s, trying to think about figures like Lewis in particular, early letters, early notes of him trying to identify her birth date, her death date. And what I have on this particular slide is a letter that he wrote in 1969, a year before his death, where he is still trying to identify, the date of death for Lewis or where she was. Now we know that she was in London, but he was, um, still trying to identify based on all of the locations where she lived because she moved around some. And so I was fascinated with, just those types of discoveries from, the figure of Porter. Ironically, Porter was the one who actually made it possible for Forever Free to enter into Howard University Gallery's collection of art, um, and was able to procure it for the museum, which was really critical. And we're so happy he was able to do that. But prior to that, one slide that Jeff showed earlier, he had an image of Hagar when he was discussing religion in Lewis. And there was also a letter in the papers that suggests that he was trying to purchase Hagar for Howard University, but he was not able to acquire it in time. And it was purchased, I believe, in 1967 by the Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, and now it is located at the Smithsonian American. So, at least, it is still in the vicinity of Howard, and it's in a major collection where it can be seen by students there. But it was just interesting to see how even, Porter himself was trying to acquire works by Lewis. So again, the other thing that to note about James Porter was that he was trying to, at the time that around 1969, that was also when he was, um, reissuing an edition of Modern Negro Art. So some of these new discoveries he was trying to incorporate into his text, Modern Negro Art, in terms of like a second edition of it. And there was another edition that appeared in 1992 where David Driscoll writes a preface. So that document becomes really important, not only in terms of showing Porter as an early scholar on Lewis, but also kind of this search for Lewis's history and her, and trying to kind of resurrect her for scholarship purposes. And if I go to the next slide. And so what I love about this project is that not only Howard, but also other historically Black colleges or other institutions that I've, been able to enjoy and to learn about the works by Lewis there. I've been able to at least, come closer to understanding them and also their relevance for this project. Um, there's the image of the old arrow maker and his daughter, which was also an early work important to the works of Lewis that kind of depict indigenous populations, or at least the guise of them through Longfellow's poem, Song of Hiawatha. And, knowing that these works are available, in different versions was really important for us for this project, for a technical study that we conducted that Jeff showed some earlier slides, of a variety of institutions, and to have some of the earliest examples, or to be able to look at different examples over time and find them in repositories like a Tuskegee University, was really important, and look at the nuance of the sculpture, over time physically. But also to know just kind of this tradition of supporting Lewis, whether it be through Black, organizations like sororities, women's clubs, Black scholars like Elaine Locke and James Porter and others, that this was kind of an ongoing kind of tradition of preserving Lewis's legacy amongst many of those institutions. And then we have these examples here today. And then the one last slide. And then to think about things like, the whole idea of commemoration. We see the portrait bust of Minnehaha and Hiawatha, and how they become, even though it's based on a a poem, it's somewhat of a fictional depiction. It also speaks to this whole idea of commemoration and celebration of the idea of certain personalities. And so Lewis, over the course of her career, portrait busts were very important, not only in terms of her, of course, trying to get commissions and, celebrating certain heroes, but it was also kind of a part of a longer tradition amongst Black artists of depicting heroes, or, those who, may have come before, that have a historical tie to different populations. And so I just put up this, we talked a little bit about how, there are all these omissions and absences, or there were these characters and personalities that were involved with Lewis's career, but we might not have examples of her work by those artists. I mean, of those figures. And so Frederick Douglass, for example, is one such individual that was an important part of Lewis's career, encouraging her, and promoting her career, visiting her in Italy, even right before she leaves Italy. And I just showed this image of Isaac Scott Hathaway, early 20th century Black sculptor that doesn't always get a lot of discussion, taught at Tuskegee, as well as University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff. And to show that kind of tradition of depicting Black heroes, and kind of, this kind of cottage industry of selling these examples, so much like Lewis, and making, kind of reproducing them and making them available to different audiences, that becomes really important in the whole ocean of representation, or Black representation, for many 20th century Black artists that would follow. And so just kind of like creating some alignments between what Lewis was doing in the 19th century, and how it kind of morphs into how early 20th century Black artists were thinking about representation. I think is another important aspect of the project. So I think that's the end of my slides.
Anya, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. And now we're excited to introduce our next speaker, David Daly. David is the curator at Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters, National Historic Site. He has been at the Longfellow House since 2001, and since joining the staff, he has worked to bring more family objects into the collection of the museum, along with extensive research into the members of Longfellow's family and their history. David?
All right. Thank you, Anne. Let's see if the technology gods are any kinder to me. Okay. Is that working?
Seems to be.
Okay, good. So I am going to briefly talk about Edmonia Lewis and Henry Longfellow's relationship to each other, or perhaps more accurately, their surprising lack of one, considering Lewis's work based on some of his writing and on Henry himself. So Lewis came to Boston in late 1863 or early 1864, where she claimed to have first conceived the idea of becoming a sculptor after seeing a statue of Benjamin Franklin. So she sought training in the art, and with the help of abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, she secured an introduction to the sculptor Edward Augustus Brackett. Now, by this time, Brackett had already made a name for himself, sculpting busts of a lot of prominent abolitionists, including one of John Brown in 1860. And it was this bust of Brown that attracted Lewis's attention. She reportedly said about it that a man who made a bust of John Brown must be a friend of my people. So she began to study sculpting with instruction from Brackett, who loaned her some of his own works for her to use as models. And she worked out of a studio on Tremont Street, not far from Boston Common. So what is the connection with Henry Longfellow here? And if I can get this to advance. There we go. That work? Are we on the next slide? Someone confirm? Yep, great. So Brackett's work on busts of Boston area abolitionists put him in connection with Longfellow's own circle of friends and acquaintances. And he sculpted a bust of Henry, which you can see here in this slide, in 1843. Now, this is long before Henry had achieved the peak of his fame with his later epic poems, such as Evangeline and especially the Song of Hiawatha in 1855. And Longfellow didn't seem to think much of Brackett's sculpture of himself and did not get a copy of it, but he did send one to his father, Stephen, writing to him in 1844 that I ordered from Brackett's a copy of the bust he made of me to be sent to you, though I think it very poor. So the one pictured here is now actually in our collection. We don't know exactly how it got to the Longfellow house in Cambridge, presumably not through Henry because he didn't like it. Perhaps it's the one he sent to his father in Portland, Maine, and it came after Henry's death in 1882. We're just not sure. So that's another thing for us to chase down. But certainly by the time Edmonia Lewis arrives in Boston and starts studying under Brackett, Longfellow is a very famous poet and writer. And if Edmonia had not already been familiar with his work, it seems likely she would have become acquainted with it during her stay in Boston. And maybe she even spotted Henry on the streets in town because he was a regular visitor to Boston with friends and family in there. And he also even shopped on Tremont Street where her studio was on occasion. So she might have spotted him there. Maybe Edmonia also saw a copy of Brackett's bust of Longfellow, maybe in Brackett's own studio. We're not sure, so that's just speculation. But despite their proximity to each other, there's no record that Lewis and Longfellow ever met or crossed paths while she was in Boston. But just as Brackett's bust of John Brown attracted her attention, we know that Longfellow's poem, Song of Hiawatha, did the same, as it addressed a facet of Lewis's own heritage, that being her Native American background. Through her mother, as a descendant of the Ojibwa or Chippewa people, the poem Song of Hiawatha might have had a special attraction to her because the legends that Longfellow drew on for writing the poem were largely of those people who were Edmonia's ancestors. And as we've already seen some pictures, Lewis's sculptures based on characters in Longfellow's poem would become some of her best known works. And here's some examples of Hiawatha and Minnehaha, and again, the old arrow maker. So these were all made before she started work on her bust of Henry himself. Lewis's relationship with Brackett deteriorates after less than a year that she spends under his instruction. So due to this, and also probably the continued prejudice and bias that she experiences in Boston, even in at least an oblique manner from some abolitionists, such as Lydia Maria Child, she leaves in about 1865 to go work and study in Rome. She actually makes enough money selling her own work, primarily copies of her bust of Robert Gould Shaw, the slain commander of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, to fund that move to Rome. So Edmonia and Henry don't cross paths until about 4 years later, while she is working in Rome and Henry is staying there during his family's grand tour of Europe. And here is a picture of the extended Longfellow family on that grand tour. Just to tell you who's who in this photo, standing from left to right in the back are Henry's younger brother, Samuel, and then Henry's oldest daughter, Alice. his brother-in-law, Thomas Gold Appleton, and then his younger son, Ernest Wadsworth Longfellow, and Ernest's wife, Harriet Spellman. And it's their honeymoon that is the occasion for this grand tour. If you can imagine taking your entire family along on your honeymoon. And then the front row, seated from left to right, is Anne Longfellow Pierce, who I'm sure is known to many people in Maine, donated the house to the Maine Historical Society. And then we have Henry's daughter, Edith, sitting to his proper right, our left, Henry himself in the center, his youngest daughter, Annie, and then another sister, Mary Longfellow Greenleaf. And it's Anne Longfellow Pierce who keeps perhaps the most detailed journal of the whole grand tour, but sadly she does not mention Lewis in it at all. She mentions almost every other sculptor they talked to, which may be telling in itself. During their stay in Rome, the Longfellows stay at the Hotel Costanzi, which is noted by Henry in his journal as being, quote, the best in Rome. And Edmonia Lewis was then renting space just off the Piazza Barberini, and the Hotel Costanzi was literally across the way from her studio, like literally across the street. So this nearness to the Longfellow family's lodgings in Rome would have made it very easy for her to observe Henry as he came and went from the hotel. Her reluctance to directly approach him and maybe ask him to sit for her could have been the result of many factors. She certainly did not seem to benefit from her acquaintance with a number of other American sculptors in Rome. None of them apparently offered to provide her with an introduction to Henry. And I also speculate that maybe she found Longfellow's own tremendous celebrity status daunting. He was really a massive star, and she may have doubted that a request coming directly from her for a sitting would have been accepted. And then I actually have a image of the Piazza Barberini from about that time. This stereograph card from our collection was acquired by Sam Longfellow, Henry's brother, almost surely during that 1868-1869 trip. And using the address for Lewis's studio, which is given in a tourist guidebook to Rome, published by John Murray, the one I used was from 1867, along with help from Google Earth satellite imagery of modern Rome. The view here shows looking towards the Via di San Nicolo del Tontino, just off the Piazza Barberini, where her studio would have been located. So the taller building to the left in this image is actually still standing, and thanks to the magic of Google Street View, you might be able to pick it out there in the picture. The street that both the hotel and Lewis's studio was on would be just to the right of the fountain, sort of a narrow, almost alleyway, it looks like in this photograph, but it would have been right down a block or two down that street and right across from each other. So also, not that Lewis would have been aware of this, but Longfellow didn't seem to enjoy spending time sitting for artists, whether it was painting, sculpture, what have you. He repeatedly laments in his journals about the time wasted that he spends sitting for portraits. And also, just before arriving in Rome, while they'd been in Florence, Henry had already agreed to sit for a bust by then long-established American sculptor Hiram Powers. And here's a copy of that bust that is in the collection of Harvard Art Museums. So as a result of all these factors, maybe Lewis's approach to essentially stalking Longfellow to get an idea of what he looked like was a good one. Also possibly unknown to her was that she was not the only sculptor working on a bust of Longfellow in 1869, even in Rome. There's an entry in one of Henry's journals a few years later in 1872 that notes that while he is in Boston, he went to town and saw Hasseltine's bust of me made in Rome in 1869, a clever piece of work, I should say. So this is almost surely the sculptor James Henry Hasseltine, an artist who studied in Europe, returned to the US to serve in the Civil War, and then goes to Rome, where he lives and works for the rest of his life. And we have an image of his bust of Henry. This is in the National Portrait Gallery in the Smithsonian Institution. So the point of showing you the images of the Powers bust and the Hasseltine bust is to illustrate that clearly at this time, Longfellow was very much a hot commodity. He's eagerly sought after as a subject by American sculptors based in Italy. So there's a lot of competition, which may have added impetus to Lewis's initial plan to just sort of surreptitiously sculpt him and not directly approach him. So the Longfellows arrive in Rome in December 1868. They finally become aware of Edmonia and the fact that she's working on a bust of Henry a month later. And so within that month, that's not a lot of time. Lewis must have begun work on the bust of Henry pretty soon after he had arrived. And maybe she got the news of their arrival from Harriet Hosmer, who had taken Edmonia under her wing when she first arrived in Rome in about 1865. So this picture of Harriet Hosmer actually comes from one of the Longfellow family photo albums collected during that grand tour. Hosmer calls on the Longfellows multiple times during their stay in Rome, and we have great evidence of that from Henry's sister Anne's journal entries. And she notes at least a couple of visits before the family becomes aware of Edmonia. On January 17, 1869, Anne made this entry in her journal, writing, HWL and Sam dined with Harriet Hosmer and an evening party afterward at Miss Cushman's. So it's perhaps during one of these visits with Harriet Hosmer that the Longfellows first hear of Edmonia and the fact that she's working on a bust of Henry. But their direct attention to her is sparked by a visit to her studio made by Henry's younger brother, Samuel. He was in that first image of the whole family I showed you, and there he is again on the left at about this time. But details of the encounter are a bit sketchy. The best account comes from another sculptor, Anne Whitney, who is working in Rome. She is also from Massachusetts, and she had known and briefly worked with Edmonia Lewis during Lewis's time in Boston. But there's a great letter that Whitney writes to her family in February 1869, where she gives a pretty good report of Sam Longfellow's first encounter with Edmonia Lewis. And she writes to her family, Miss Lewis has been making a bust of Mr. Long. Her studio is near the Costanzi Hotel where they are, and she got glimpses of him here and there, went out to meet him and headed him off round corners, Samuel told us. And when he, Samuel, went into her studio one day, he found quite a respectable likeness of his brother. Then the rest of the family went in, and the nose being a failing feature, Mr. L sat to her, and they think it now quite a creditable performance. Better, I think, he said, than many likenesses of him. So it looks like they started off pretty well. They liked the sculpture. And then we have additional firsthand family information coming from Henry's then 18-year-old daughter, Alice Longfellow. Alice writes in her journal on January 19, 1869, Miss Edmonia Lewis, an American sculptress, has also made a bust without a sitting, watching him whenever he went out. And then the next day, January 20th, she writes, went over to Edmonia Lewis's studio, which is just opposite, to see her bust of Papa, but she was out. Unfortunately, those two journal entries by Alice seem to be the only mentions made of Edmonia by any direct member of the Longfellow family, at least that we have discovered so far. And this encounter in Rome is the only documented time that Henry Longfellow and Edmonia Lewis ever meet. No mention of Lewis is made in Sam Longfellow's biography of his brother, which is published in 1886. Edmonia does not show up in any of Henry's correspondence, nor even his own journal entries of the 1868-1869 Grand Tour. In fact, the portion of the trip when the Longfellow family stays in Rome, Henry makes no entries in his journal, and the few letters that he writes while he is there are generally complaining about the rainy weather and expressing a desire to leave Rome as soon as possible. And then we get to the Harvard bust that Edmonia made. So this bust, owned by Harvard Art Museums, is a marble copy of the one that she was working on in clay in 1869 when the family comes to her studio and meets her. We do know a little bit about Harvard's acquisition of this bust from a couple of magazine and newspaper articles at the time. We have a July 31, 1869 article in the Christian Recorder that writes, Miss Edmonia Lewis, now on a short visit to the United States, has recently executed a colossal bust in plaster of our great poet, Henry W. Longfellow. The model is at her studio in Rome and is considered by all Americans who have seen it to be a fine specimen of art, as well as a most excellent and truthful likeness of her subject. She proposes to execute the bust in marble. It is one which should find a place in Harvard University, and the friends of our renowned scholar will do well to obtain this work of art from Miss Lewis for that purpose. The cost of the bust in marble will be about $700. Professor Childs, and that's Francis James Childs, who was in 1871 the Harvard Professor of Rhetoric and Oratory. So Professor Childs says, I have seen the photograph of Miss Lewis's bust of Professor Longfellow and should consider a copy in marble a very desirable acquisition for Harvard College. The college at present possesses no portrait of any sort of Professor Longfellow. A subscription has been started to raise the required sum. This is headed by some of our well-known citizens prominent in good works. And then we have another article printed in the People's Advocate newspaper of Osage Mission, Kansas, in June of 1871 that reported a fine bust, also of this same poet, is about to be put in marble, which has been ordered by Harvard College. And in this instance, at least old Harvard has done itself honor. If it will not yet open its doors to women who ask education at its hands, it will admit the work of a woman who has educated herself in her chosen department. So Harvard ultimately acquires the bust the next year, 1872, for $700, which by some metrics, it's tough to measure these things, but is the equivalent of about $18,000 in today's money. But as far as Henry's reaction to the bust, so far we've been unable to find any mention in any of his writings. In addition, there does not seem to have been any effort on his part to acquire any of Lewis's work, even of her Hiawatha-related pieces. But over the past 50 years, this bust, the Harvard one, has been displayed at various locations, both at Harvard and also at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, the Cleveland Museum of Art, the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, and Middlebury College in Vermont. So we, the Longfellow House, are currently in discussion with Harvard Art Museums to borrow this bust of Longfellow for an upcoming open season. Even though it never resided in Longfellow's home, the opportunity to display it in the house will really enable the Park Service to further explore both the extent of Longfellow's own impact on American culture and his fame, while at the same time highlighting Edmonia Lewis and her work. So we've had conversations with Horace Ballard, the curator of American art at Harvard, and we have tentative plans to borrow and display it in 2026, although we still have a lot of details to work out. And appropriately enough, the space in which we hope to exhibit it is the same room in which the Edward Augustus Brackett bust that I showed earlier is displayed, and that would make for a nice closing of the circle in some sense. And before I conclude, I do want to mention that there is another bust of Henry by Lewis out there, and this is it. It is currently in the collections of the National Museums Liverpool in Liverpool, England, and it's very similar to the Harvard bust. There are some slight differences, but it's clearly based on the same clay sculpture she worked on in 1869. This is completed in 1872, and it's purchased by Henry Robertson Sandbach. He's a member of a wealthy British merchant family that makes their fortune exporting goods from plantations that relied on slave labor, both in South America and the Caribbean. Though Sandbach was an avid art collector himself, and he had a lot of connections to many of the British and American expatriate artists working in Rome in the 1860s and 1870s. So the Longfellow bust by Lewis stayed in that family until 2001, when it was given to the UK government in lieu of a tax payment. And then a couple of years later, the government allocated it to the National Museums in Liverpool, where it is still displayed today. So I feel that these two busts by Lewis are some of the most compelling ever done of Henry. And I think the fact that we're still talking about them as we are today, and that they are displayed in prominent museums, both here and in the UK, is a real testament to her skill and talent, especially when we consider that most of her work on them was done without the benefit of a formal sitting from Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. So that's really remarkable. So that concludes my piece, and I'm going to try to stop sharing. I think that worked, and I'm going to introduce our next speaker, and that's Benjamin Pokros, PhD. He is currently the National Park Service Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow here at the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters in Cambridge, Mass. So I've had a chance to get to know him a bit. He's been spending a lot of time with us here. Ben received his PhD in 2023 from Yale, writing a dissertation on popular genres of historical writing in the 19th century. He has taught at Yale, the University of Tulsa, and also with the Warrior Scholar Project. And with that, I'll sign off and turn it over to Ben.
Okay, can you hear me now? And see everything good? Okay, great.
Yep.
All right, so thanks, David, and thank you to to Howard University, the Bowdoin College Museum of Art, and curator Laura Sprague for inviting me to speak. I also want to thank Danielle Morgado for making things technically possible. So like David said, my name is Ben Pokros, and I'm the NPS Mellon postdoc at the Longfellow House. So before I begin, I have to say that this talk was made possible through the National Park Service by a grant from the National Park Foundation through generous support from the Mellon Foundation. So in my presentation today, I want to build on the discussion of Edmonia Lewis that we've been hearing. So Lewis was clearly interested in Longfellow and his 1855 poem, The Song of Hiawatha. David just discussed her bust of the poet, and she also, as Shania and Jeff showed, produced a series of sculptures in the late 1860s and early 1870s of characters from Hiawatha. So here we see Hiawatha, the poem's hero, and Minnehaha, his love interest. So what I'd like to do today is to think about the broader context of cultural representations of the Song of Hiawatha in the second half of the 19th century. Thinking about these representations can help us to understand more about Lewis artistry, I think. And I'm going to be highlighting in particular the way that artists of color took up Hiawatha, focusing on two examples. Mary Webb, who's here on the left, a Black woman who did public readings in the 1850s that included selections from the poem, and the inaugural Hiawatha pageant, put on by members of the Garden River First Nation, an Anishinaabe community in northwestern Ontario. And I want to center my remarks around two main themes. The first is about the nation. As we'll see, if the Song of Hiawatha came to be seen as a myth of American identity, the poem becomes a useful tool for those operating between the United States and other nations, as well as for those thinking about the promise and limitations of America. The second is about race and racialization. The Song of Hiawatha is sort of a notorious act of cultural appropriation. But do these performances offer the chance to reclaim forms of cultural identity, or do they trouble notions of cultural identity at all? So these are kind of the two things that I want to think a little bit about today. So to start, the Song of Hiawatha was first published in 1855. Longfellow was by this point a very well-known and established poet, but the subject matter was new for him. The poem describes the life and adventures of Hiawatha, a fictionalized Ojibwe hero. He found this topic not through his own experiences with any real Indigenous people, but rather from stories he read by a white ethnologist, Henry Rowe Schoolcraft. The poem was an immediate success, though not without controversy. And in fact, I think some of the controversy helped the success. Some objected to the meter he used, trochaic tetrameter, taken from the Finnish epic, the Kalevala. And the poem led to a huge number of adaptations across a variety of media. So scholars usually think of Hiawatha's popularity in two parts. The first is right after the poem's publication. So there were parodies, there were public performances, there were, as we see on the right here, songs that used characters from the poem. Here's the Minnehaha polka. We can even see an artist like the German-American landscape painter Albert Bierstadt putting his own spin on the sort of famous or maybe infamous final scene of the poem where Hiawatha disappears before the advent of white settlers. So this is his sort of departure of Hiawatha from 1868. The second is sometimes called the Hiawatha Revival around the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, so kind of around 1900. And at this time, there are even more adaptations characterized, I would say, by an even stronger visual representation of Hiawatha. So just to take two examples, I have here on the screen the Hiawatha painting book, which is a coloring book, basically, or a painting book for children. And on the right, one page from Florence Holbrook's Hiawatha alphabet, which is basically teaching you the ABCs through Hiawatha. So how do we kind of understand Hiawatha's popularity? There are many explanations, but I want to focus on just two. The first is that at the time of its publication, the poem provided a shared and imagined cultural heritage for a nation on the brink of civil war. There had been a long-standing anxiety in American culture about the nation's supposed lack of history, especially when compared with Europe. The indigenous past in Longfellow's poem becomes a solution to this absence, a story that can be appropriated and celebrated as a truly American epic. The second, and here I'm building on the arguments of scholar Alan Trachtenberg, is that Hiawatha's second wind around 1900 is due to the arrival of waves of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. Hiawatha becomes a way of talking about the process of naturalization, what it means to be and become an American, at a moment when this was a very fraught question. And it is in this context that I'd like to shift to talking about my two main examples, starting with Mary Webb. So Mary Webb was a Black woman born in New Bedford, Massachusetts, the daughter of a woman who had escaped enslavement in Virginia. At 17, she married Frank Webb, who had been born in Philadelphia's free Black community and who would go on to write The Garys and Their Friends, one of the first novels published by an African American. Mary's career as a public reader began after her husband's business failed in 1855, when she embraced the then popular style of public readings, which are sort of solo performances of written texts in front of an audience. At the time, this was considered more respectable and upper class than other forms of popular performance, like theater or blackface minstrelsy. So this was a little bit more of a sort of more respectable thing to do. So she was very successful, attracting the attention of Harriet Beecher Stowe, whose 1852 novel Uncle Tom's Cabin was still incredibly popular. Stowe, in fact, wrote a version of that novel explicitly for Webb's performance, entitled The Christian Slave, which Webb toured throughout the Northeast and across England. Her career in the public eye was very short, however. She moved with her husband to Jamaica in 1858, where she died the next year. So while Uncle Tom's Cabin and The Christian Slave were at the center of her repertoire, she is often described in newspapers and by observers as performing sections from Longfellow's poem, and even performing it in, quote, in the picturesque costume of the North American Indians. It can be hard to recover what her performances were like. We obviously don't have any recordings. But looking closely at the way Webb was talked about can give us some understanding of what she might have been up to in reciting some of Hiawatha, and especially, I think, can show us how her performance may have disrupted some ideas about sort of racialized representation in the period. So to give just two examples of people talking about Lewis, or talking about Webb. Here we have a review from the Birmingham Gazette, which says, portions of Longfellow's poem of Hiawatha were also read by Mrs. Webb, dressed in Indian costume, with a fine discrimination and perception of its numerous beauties. And on the bottom are some lines from the diary of Charlotte Fortin Grimke, a free Black woman who lived in Philadelphia. In the evening, Mrs. Webb read Uncle Tom's Cabin, dramatized, and portions of Hiawatha. I thought she read remarkably well. The humorous portions were perhaps the best. They were read capitally. The pathetic portions were touchingly and beautifully read. So what's striking to me in these assessments of Webb is their emphasis on her interpretive skill. The Birmingham Gazette praises her for her discernment and perception. Grimke notes that the funny parts are funny and the sad parts are sad. So this emphasis on skill is important, I think, in the context of Black antebellum performance, which was so often seen, especially by white observers, as being about the sort of material incarnation of ideas about race. For example, in the idea that formerly enslaved abolitionist speakers were saying something about slavery through their very bodies. So sort of speaking in front of an audience, their bodies were testifying something. Webb, on the other hand, is seen as a skilled performer, able to act out identities different from her own. Not only all the characters she played in The Christian Slave, but even Native American characters. in her interpretation of Hiawatha. In this context, we might think about the oft-repeated note that she read Hiawatha, quote, in Indian dress. What is required for her to convincingly read a Native American story? Something about the fiction of race is being highlighted in her performance as she plays off of American and English ideas about racialization and embodiment. My second example, the Garden River Hiawatha pageant, presents a very different version of Longfellow's poem. Organized by L.O. Armstrong, the so-called colonization officer of the Canadian Pacific Railroad, in collaboration with George Kabausa, a member of the Garden River First Nation, the pageant was a staged version of Longfellow's poem in Ojibwe, with primarily Native actors. It took place in Desbarats, Ontario, on Lake Huron, close to Sault Ste. Marie on the border between Michigan and Canada. And they invited Longfellow's family to the first performance in August of 1900. And it is thanks to Joseph Thorpe Jr., the husband of one of Longfellow's daughters, that we have these images. And you can see on the screen two of the actors who performed in the pageant that first summer of 1900. So the initial performance was a success, and the pageant ran at Desbarats until 1918, with occasional revivals even into the 1960s. They toured, staging the pageants as far away as Boston and New York, and other Anishinaabe communities in northern Michigan and northwestern Ontario began to perform the play as well. So this sort of idea of the pageant spreads. So the Hiawatha performances are complex cultural artifacts. One way of interpreting them would be to see it as Native people performing stereotyped versions of indigeneity. Especially by the end of the 19th century, Hiawatha had come to be the preeminent symbol of the noble savage, a version of indigeneity that respectfully vanishes before oncoming white settlement. They were stereotyped even in small ways. This image, another photograph taken from Joseph Thorpe, gives a more complete sense of what they were wearing, which are not really reflective of Anishinaabe or Great Lakes traditions, but instead are a kind of amalgamation of different kinds of plains regalia. And the performance was, as I've mentioned, established by a Canadian railway company for the express purpose of promoting the railroad. And in this brochure advertisement for the 1902 season, the language is extremely touristic, announcing Desbarats, the Indian playground. And I'll just read a little bit. Hiawatha Camp is situated upon a point which commands one of the most exquisite lake views in America and is in the center of a fish and game region, most of which has been undisturbed by the white man. In and about the camp are comfortable accommodations for the transient and permanent guest, including tent or teepee life if desired. So the Longfellow's trip, in the light of this brochure, is a kind of trial run for a broader establishment of Desbarats as a tourist attraction, a place where white travelers could experience a sort of quote-unquote authentic glimpse at Indigenous life. Yet this isn't all. Members of Garden River were involved in the production from the beginning, and it became an important way for these relatively isolated communities to make money. And more than a purely commercial performance, it was a place to maintain cultural traditions. Songs were passed down through the performances, jokes were inserted into the text, both overtly and between the actors. It was a chance to speak publicly in their own language and to tell their own stories. So I include here 2 pages from the program that was made to accompany the 1902 performances, where one side of it on the left is in English, the other in Ojibwe. So the language is being held up and preserved here, no matter that it is being done in a potentially sort of compromised way. So here on the border between Canada, the United States, and sovereign Native nations, we have to imagine that these performances exceeded the colonial frame, that they gave members of the Garden River First Nation the opportunity to insist on the continuity of their culture. So with these examples in mind, I want to end by returning to the Lewis sculptures with which we began and leaving you with some questions just to think about or to bring up in the Q&A. So how might we think about these sculptures in the light of Lewis's journey between, and Jeff has sort of started talking about this, Niagara Falls, the East Coast, and Italy? How might we think about these sculptures as caught up in the complexities of racialized embodiment in the 19th century? Is Lewis saying something about her Ojibwe heritage through them, or is she pointing out something about popular representations about Native Americans? Looking forward to the Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ben, for a fascinating presentation. And indeed, thank you to each of our speakers. This has been incredibly lively and extremely interesting. I want to turn things over now, if I can, to our audience and invite feedback, questions. Please feel free either to use the chat function or simply to raise your hand. I'm going to be relying on the electronic hand raise, if you don't mind. And at this time, I may take the moderator's prerogative to ask the first question, if I may. And again, I thought all of the presentations were fascinating. And sort of thinking through the presentations leading from Jeff through Ben, a question came to mind that I would be interested actually to have all of you speak about. And that is this question of American identity. Jeff, I was very interested in your comments about Lewis's quote unquote magnum opus being that large bust of Cleopatra dying. And I'm reminded of a classical sculpture that James Bowdoin gave to Thomas Jefferson, believing that it represented Cleopatra. We know now that that was not the case, but nonetheless, there seems to be an association between, or perhaps there's an association between her rule and aspects of American identity, this American Republic. And Ben, I was so interested in your comments about the Song of Hiawatha and the idea that this somehow served as a narrative that was embracing of individuals who worked to express their American identity. And then, of course, thinking about Edmonia Lewis's investment in depicting a particular American author, Longfellow, David, that you spoke to, and Shania, even thinking about the way in which Edmonia Lewis's work has been interpreted by members of the Academy. I just wondered if you all might be able to speak a little bit about Edmonia Lewis's perceptions of her own quote unquote American identity, the degree to which perhaps Longfellow offered either a way of connecting herself to somebody who she saw as quote unquote American, or perhaps as a foil for distinguishing herself from one particular brand of American identity. So I would welcome everybody's thoughts on that question. And after you conclude your thoughts, we'll turn to Melanie Harvey for her question.
Well, I can start since I went first in the roundup here. So I think one of the things that we have been seeing and saying about Edmonia Lewis is there's something for everyone in Edmonia Lewis's story, and therefore Edmonia Lewis, both in her lifetime and afterwards, is this sort of every woman who is connected in so many different ways to the many strands of 19th century American history and the many tensions and contradictions of the quote unquote American story. So I think what we are trying to do in our exhibition is sort of hold all these things together. What falls under this sort of umbrella that we come to associate with Lewis as an American artist, or perhaps even North American, and that her ancestral ties are to a First Nation in present day Canada, but also to really kind of create a big tent for her sculpture by by understanding, Lewis as an American artist by understanding her within her many communities that I think really also exceed our typical categories or means of understanding American art and American artistry in the 19th century. And it's sort of interesting that David brought up the Sandbach Commission sculpture of Longfellow. There's this wonderful quote that Sandbach records Lewis as saying when he buys the sculpture from her, commissions the sculpture out of her studio in 1872. So he knows about the sculpture being at Harvard, and he said, I ordered a copy at natural size, meaning it's smaller than the one that's at Harvard, for 500 pounds. And Lewis said to me, the good spirit always sends me friends. And that is sort of our motto with this show, is thinking about like Lewis, her friendships, her communities, her affinities, her solidarities, and the sort of overflow of that really, I think also gets us outside of, in certain ways, these strict definitions of what makes Lewis an American artist per se. So that's how I would respond to that. I don't know if anyone else wants to speak to it.
Thank you. And Shania, it looks like you may have some thoughts, but you're on mute right now.
Sorry about that. I was just going to add that I think the other part that's interesting about Lewis, and it's kind of been suggested, is this kind of transatlantic travel, between Italy, the United States. Like Lewis, was always coming back at some point. I mean, we tend to think of, Americanists and being American as kind of this static sensibility of being in, the continental states or so forth. But, I love the fact that Lewis, as much as she, adapted to her environment, adapted to being in Italy and creating there, that there was always this dialogue back and forth, always travel, like looking at manifests of ships and trying to get back to sell work, to promote her work, communicating with people of different organizations, different supporters of her work. So there was never like this complete detachment, from her connection to America, whether we look at, her returning to or her corresponding with her brother, who was in Montana, whether it was visiting her aunts and, or trying to connect with other people that may have been on this part of the continent. So, this whole, I mean, I think in many ways she kind of shows an expanded view of kind of Americanness that is both localized but also global sensibility. So.
Shania, thank you so much, Ben.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that those great comments to say that I think Longfellow is interesting in this regard because he's so interested in pulling from different aspects of American history. You think about Evangeline being about the Acadians, Miles Standish is about Puritan history, Hiawatha is about Native American history. So he is kind of, I mean, in his maybe problematic way, kind of creating this, trying to embrace a broad tent of American history. So I think that maybe, Lewis may in some ways be thinking about that in her interest in him.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I think that's a fascinating point. And David, I don't see you coming off mute. So unless you
I can, yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, I don't want to overlook any contributions you might want to make, but we can also move on to Melanie if that.
Well, no, just real quick. I'm not going to draw any conclusions, but I just think it's a fascinating story talking about, again, what it means to be an American. Here you have the sculptor who is drawing from facets of her own heritage and mixing in the inspiration from this American poet, as Ben was just saying, but then goes to Italy where she feels more comfortable working, but she's still sculpting things that are intrinsically American and largely for an American market. Shania was talking about constantly corresponding and coming back in times to drum up business. It's not the people of Italy that are maybe eating up Hiawatha related things as much as it is the American people. So what does that say? I think it says a lot. I'm not going to offer my opinions right here on what it says. We don't have time for that, but it's just a multifaceted story to dig into, and what does it all mean? And I just think it's just a really interesting one from every way you look at it. So
Thank you so much, David. Um, let's turn now to Melanie Harvey for her question.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm sorry I missed the totality of the talks, but Ben, I had a really, I think it's a good question for you because I've always, when I've encountered Edmonia Lewis and Hiawatha and that kind of tale, I've always been interested in how it's been translated to other forms. So to hear these examples of performance is really enlightening. On my end, the only performance that often is talked about, like in African American studies around such a theme, is Samuel Coleridge Taylor's composition of the Song of Hiawatha. So, can you draw any similarities or differences in like the musical reflection on this versus what we would get from an oratorical performance? And again, thank you for such rich scholarship.
Yeah, thank you, Melanie. That's a great question, and I've a lot to say about that. But I guess what I would say is, I think there were a lot of artists at that time who were interested in Hiawatha, and so Dvorak, part of his sort of American symphony is sort of inspired by Hiawatha. And I think that for Coleridge Taylor, who is a sort of Black composer, I mean, I think that Hiawatha, in a similar way, is being seen as a somewhat of maybe a symbol of America, and this symbol of this kind of novelty and newness and this sort of freshness that is being associated with America at this time. I'm not sure. Yeah, I mean, you're just making me think about, I don't know what these songs sound like. I don't know what actually these compositions are like. So I'd be interested in learning more about that. But I think, yeah, it's in this Hiawatha revival period, this sort of the freshness of America gets associated a little bit with Hiawatha, I think. But thank you for that question.
Can I jump in and add something to that as well? Just because we're speaking with this audience coming in part from Howard, whose gallery in its collection has a great landscape, which is now at Bowdoin, I believe, on loan. I haven't seen the show yet, by Robert Duncanson of Minnehaha Falls. But you have someone like Robert Duncanson, a Black painter in the now I'm testing myself, 1860s, I think, when the painting was made, who is also engaging with the story of the Song of Hiawatha. And what I think we see with a painting like that, in a sort of larger context, is this interest among African American artists and intellectuals and activists, as well as white abolitionists after the Civil War, after emancipation. There's this turn in activism towards indigenous dispossession, particularly in the plains in the American West. And the Song of Hiawatha for African American artists like Duncanson becomes a way of addressing these larger histories of marginalization, of disenfranchisement that is already happening for decades, where you have abolitionist newspapers in the early 1800s sort of comparing the enslavement of African Americans to the dispossession of Native peoples from the Southeast. And that there is this sort of language that's this sort of shared kinship, as a scholar named Anna Arabin-Kesson talks about, that colonization has these two tools that are dispossession and enslavement. And so the Song of Hiawatha becomes a means for certain artists like Duncanson to sort of take up those affinities and those histories together. So I think that's also kind of happening later too, as in a reflection on yes, the kind of like a narrative for a new nation, but also a reflection on the sort of painful histories of the United States as well.
I wonder if, as moderator, I could potentially jump in with another question. I am struck by how what an interesting role the history of educational institutions has to play when we think about the history of Edmonia Lewis in particular. Jeff, this was something that you touched on. Shania, this is something that you touched on. It's interesting to me that to think about Longfellow and Hawthorne having been educated at Bowdoin in the 1820s. It's so interesting to think about Edmonia Lewis's very difficult experience at Oberlin. But then in more recent years, it's very interesting to me to think about the role of museums and educational institutions. And I'm thinking particularly of Howard in preserving and disseminating Edmonia Lewis's reputation. I'm thinking about James Porter in particular. And because we're so happy to have been joined by Howard, who is co-sponsoring today's event, I wondered, Jeff and Shania, if this is something that you might expand a little bit further on. As a museum professional, I have become increasingly sensitive in recent years to the importance of collecting and exhibiting art, not because museums necessarily have the final word, but rather because we can get a conversation going and we can provide a place where people can come back year after year and to see pieces in new places, or rather in new contexts. And I was just wondering if you might be able to expand a little bit on the role of institutions, perhaps museums, perhaps institutions of higher education in shaping the legacy that we are all delving into today when we think about Edmonia Lewis and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. But I am particularly struck by what I think is an outsized role that has been played by Howard University in this work.
I think that, I always go back to like kind of the inception of our project, even at our institution at the Georgia Museum of Art, where, Jeff originally worked, just, I remember when when well, it was before Jeff got there, I helped acquire the Minnehaha bus that we have. And, everyone was like, well, it's, like, why was this so important? And I'm like, well, we have to be able to continue the scholarship around early figures like Lewis, because, finding works like this are so rare. The fact that we haven't been able to find her companion Hiawatha, which I'm always looking for at auction, or at least to be able to acquire one at this point, probably with the, escalating prices, I'm sure. But how critical it is to be able to start from that standpoint. And that's why the role of places like Howard or Tuskegee and others in having these early works are important. I mean, one of the sad things, that we find out is, like when we look back at, certain commissions that Lewis may have had that we're not really sure if they were executed or not, or ones that we know she had, and at other institutions where, at higher ed institutions where the works are lost, even if they're early plasters of, key figures like someone like John Brown, or Charles Sumner, some of those figures that we really wanted for the exhibition, not being able to identify them. So, or at least not as yet, or they may have been destroyed, or not quite preserved, to have, examples that are, and particularly at institutions of higher education, especially HBCUs, where much of the scholarship was produced, is really, critical.
Thank you so much. Those are beautiful reflections. Would anybody like to add anything further?
Yeah, I'll just add that I think, as Shanya's presentation indicated, I think museums have actually been a little bit late to the Edmonia Lewis legacy, and that it was actually not so much museums collecting her sculpture, but the really vital role of community organizations, of people like, Shania mentioned the Deltas, the Links in San Jose provided pedestals for the sculptures that belong to the San Jose Public Library so that those works could be displayed. I think there's a whole sort of world of individuals who were integral to preserving Lewis's art and her story, that worked outside the bounds of so-called fine art institutions for many years. And so it's very much a responsibility of museums today to sort of make right the oversight, the suppression of stories like Lewis. The really, we say Lewis was never forgotten. That narrative can be really pervasive and I think denigrates her legacy and the legacy of so many people who are part of keeping her story alive. So I think, yes, it is a story about certain institutions, importantly like Howard, and like people like Porter. But I think, it's also our responsibility today to tell these stories that have not been told in certain spheres, because they deserve a larger platform. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Very, very well said. I'm going to turn now to Catherine Coney Ali for our final question of the afternoon. Catherine.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. This has been such a wonderful program. Thank you to all the presenters. I have one question. I'm actually in class, so I have one student here that has a question, the final question. One of our grad students, Miss Taylor Day, Dunn. Hold on, here she comes.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Taylor Dunn. I'm a first year MFA student here at Howard University. And my question is regarding the kind of a bit of the background on Longfellow and like the work, the Song of Hiawatha. I know that in one of the presentations it talked a bit more about how he was essentially somewhat appropriating these different narratives. And I want to know if in any of your work, have you been able to see if there was any other scholarship or either within your own scholarship, trace back some of these original narratives that he may have been referencing?
Sounds like one for Ben.
Yeah, I can try and answer that one. So this is a big sort of question, little controversy. Most people trace them back to Henry Rowe Schoolcraft's algic researches, which were stories that Henry Rowe Schoolcraft was a sort of colonial official in Michigan. He was married to an Ojibwe woman. And so the stories, and there actually just was a book published about this, about the process of the stories coming from Jane Johnson Schoolcraft, his wife's family, into Schoolcraft's own publications, and there's a lot of editing that is happening. So there are several layers, I would say, of sort of appropriation between Longfellow and the sort of original stories. But Longfellow is really sort of remixing them. I mean, Hiawatha is an Iroquois name, but the stories are Ojibwe. So everything is kind of mixed up for him.
Anybody else want to
No, I'll just say that you know, with Henry's work, he's doing this all from basically his study. He never gets further west than Niagara Falls. He never goes further north than Maine. I think the furthest south in the country he ever gets is Alexandria, Virginia. So he is not on site investigating, interviewing, you know, getting first person narratives. So it's all very filtered through people like Schoolcraft, as Ben was saying. So it's a strange amalgamation of other secondary sources that he's using to create his work, and that's why you're getting what you get in large. So it what does that say about Henry? Travel, of course, was more difficult back then, but it's more about him creating something that fits his own ideas as much as it is trying to tell the truth about anything, an objective truth about Native Americans or whatever it may be, or Acadians, however you may have it. So that always has to be kept in mind when you're reading Longfellow. What was he thinking about? What was he trying to do? Was he trying to tell truth, or was he trying to make a sort of digestible, attractive story for the American public in his quest to create a uniquely American mythology?
Excellent. And so just to give you all just a little background, the class is research methods. And so the students have been looking at how you all approach your research and presenting it in this forum, and you know how it's being communicated. And so they were inquisitive about how this knowledge came about, especially since it's not first person. And I think that when Ben talked about appropriating, that everyone's ears went up, like appropriating. Okay, let's understand how, you know, we are able to validate and verify the information that's being presented.
What a tremendous note, I think, on which to conclude a panel about new scholarship. An opportunity to really dig into where knowledge is coming from, how it's generated, and how we both build on the lessons of the past, but also understand that we need to reframe things in our own era, and often with new information that's coming forward. I am so grateful, Catherine, to you and your students for your wonderful, insightful questions. Jeff, Shania, David, Ben, I am so grateful to each of you for your fantastic presentations. And Laura Sprague, so grateful to you for having developed a truly outstanding exhibition, which has become a springboard for so much discussion. We hope that we'll have a chance to see all of you here in Maine before the 20th of July. But as Laura mentioned, this webinar will join many other programs in our online exhibition catalog. So if you are not able to travel, we hope that your resources will be richer than those that were immediately available to Longfellow. So if you are chiming in for your study, please do take advantage of our website, but we hope we'll have a chance to see many of you here in Midcoast, Maine. Thank you for a rich afternoon. Thank you to all of our audience members for your contributions, and we wish you a beautiful evening ahead. Take care and thank you.
Thank you from Howard University.
Thank you. Bye-bye.